10,000 feet above German soil, a flight of twin-engine bombers head towards Berlin in the spring of 1945. Their job is a crucial one, to pave the way for Patton's Third Army and eliminate German defensive positions and infrastructure so casualties on the ground are minimized. But this job has plenty of its own risks, pushing some men to the breaking point in many of the most deadly bombing raids of the war. In this video, we hear from one of the men who flew these very missions, dive into the archives to see what really happened, and relive the incredible mission. In the early weeks of 1945, the German army was in retreat, but they were certainly not yet finished. One of the groups that knew this far better than any other was the United States Army's 9th Air Force, the unit responsible for providing close air support and frontline bombardment for the advancing armies pushing into Germany. This often required pilots and aircraft to fly lower and closer to the enemy than the high-altitude bombers of the 8th Air Force, and thus exposed them to a very different and often more dangerous threat. But nonetheless, day after day, these men climbed into their cockpits and took the fight directly to the Germans. In the 387th Bomb Group, one of the men providing this very support was a Carolina boy by the name of Kendall Eakes.
That's when I'm a young officer. I was probably 20 years old at that time. As I mentioned, I had my wings on and lieutenant's bars. Hot stuff.
In the 387th, Kendall flew the B-26 Marauder, an aircraft with a very unique design and reputation, operating differently than most bombers in use by the U.S. Army Air Force at this time.
We were much faster than they were, much faster, but it was much more dangerous. We carried 4,000-pound bomb load. That was almost as much as a B-17. So all I can say is we were faster and hotter.
In their B-26s, Kendall Eakes and his fellow pilots are assigned low to medium level bombing missions throughout Germany. And he remembers very well the aircraft that carried him on many of these missions.
2 planes I remember, Heavenly Body, that was the colonel's plane, and Angel, Heavenly Body, she was good looking. And barrel ass, that's barrel ass, just as the expression goes, gonna barrel ass out of here.
Currently, in Saint-Quentin, France, the 387th had just taken part in supporting the Battle of the Bulge, helping to push back the German ground forces and pave the way for Allied troops. And now, as Hitler's Wehrmacht struggles to get a foothold, it is up to the Marauders once again to keep them on the defensive. But this would come with its own set of challenges, as even the hot Marauders struggled to keep up with old blood and guts.
Patton was chasing the Germans and was routing them. We would always have an alternative target. If we were to get this one maybe in front of Patton that was giving them resistance, and we would bomb it and make it easier for him. But several times he got to the target before we did and took it and went right through. So we had to get an alternate target. And when he was going so strong and we were flying troop support, they would give us an alternate mission or 2 in case he had already got there. One I particularly remember, and I don't know exactly the timing of it, was on Koblenz, Germany. It was a town on the river. I don't know if it was the Danube or what, but we were going after some bridges in Koblenz. Koblenz was a big city, but they knew that we were coming in after those bridges. And rather than try to track us with the flak, they threw up what they call barrage flak. They tried to determine our altitude and were just shooting bombs at that altitude, a barrage. And we had to fly through that black smoke and bomb to get over those bridges. And I remember that one particularly. That was a frightening thing, having to go into these bursting shells and smoke to get over those bridges at Koblenz. I remember that.
In nearly all of these missions, anti-aircraft fire was intense and gave the 387th trouble. It was always heavy at these altitudes and very accurate. To put into perspective just how deadly this flak was for the 387th, here is a recollection of a mission from Valentine's Day 1945 by a fellow pilot in the unit with Kendall Eakes. It was February 14th, 1945, and at a briefing, I saw the reconnaissance photos of our target, a railroad bridge at Engers, Germany. I was to fly the number 2 position in my flight, and the ship I was to fly was a new one in our squadron, named the Texas Queen. I met the co-pilot at the ship. He was from a replacement crew that had just come into the squadron. His name was Lieutenant McDonough. I'll never forget when he introduced himself to me because he said, "Boy, at this rate, I'll be going home in just a couple of weeks." When I asked what he was talking about, he said he had just gone on his first mission and this was to be his second. Little did I know what a prophet he was. As I was flying in the number 2 position, I was resting my head against the middle window while watching the wing of the lead plane on my left. We arrived at the IP and turned to start on the bombing run. The bomb bay doors were open and we had started towards the target when we took our first direct hit. The explosion of the shell deafened me and blew my sunglasses off. My vision was blurred, so I wiped my face and eyes, and taking my hand away, I saw all this flesh and blood. I thought, my God, they've shot my face off, but I didn't feel any pain. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw McDonough falling between our seats. I saw about half of his thigh had been blown off. The debris and flesh and blood from his thigh is what had blurred my vision. I managed to get Thorin, my engineer, up to the cockpit and attend to McDonough. I was doing my best to keep my position in the flight. Since my vision was still blurred, I moved my head forward in the front window compartment to see the lead plane better. Just after my head moved forward, a shell came through the middle window and hit between the top hatches, blowing them open, damaging the trim cables and taking out the radio. If I hadn't moved my head to the front glass, I would have never known what hit me. It would have simply taken my head off. So, McDonough getting hit and part of his thigh being blown into my face caused me to move the position of my head, which saved my life and undoubtedly the entire crew. With all of that going on, I still managed to keep the plane in a reasonably good formation until our bombs were released on the target. We took another hit just as the bombs went away, and a piece of flak came up through my parachute and between my flight jacket's inner and outer lining. It exited below the collar of the left shoulder area. There was no way I could fly formation and keep up with the lead plane taking evasive action to get away from the target area. I remember going into a dive and seeing the airspeed indicator go past the red line. I started to the base as fast as I could go. Thorin and Suitors worked at getting the hatches closed and began administering to Lieutenant McDonough using sulfur powder, morphine, and bandages. I got back to the airbase ahead of the group and started a straight-in approach. As I pulled off the end of the runway and onto the taxi strip, the ambulances were right out there, so I killed the engine and the rescue crew brought out stretchers to take McDonough out. Sergeant Suitors was also hit, but not as severely. They took him and McDonough to the field hospital, and our surgeon did surgery on them. Recollection of 387th Bomb Group pilot Joseph O. Stevens. It was devastating flak like this that gave the Marauders such a hard time as their targets pushed deeper and deeper into the Reich. But if there was any silver lining, it was that at this point in the war, there was rarely any threat of German fighter intercept, and their escorts were thankfully plentiful and skilled.
I forget the name of the plane, it doesn't come to me, but they would come up to our 6-ship formation and do a barrel roll around us and then perch up above us. That was interesting and comforting to see that. Spitfire was the name of that plane. When I got there, the German Air Force wasn't the power it once was. It had lost most of its power, so we weren't troubled too much with fighter planes, but the anti-aircraft fire, we had a lot of that.
What was not comforting, however, was the living situation, as the 387th still battled the end of a harsh and cold winter in Saint-Quentin, France.
We were covered up with snow. We lived in tents. The only heat we had was a little stove, and we had trouble getting wood or coal to burn to generate heat. And in many occasions, we slept in our flight suit, which was insulated. If it was particularly cold, this was an insulated garment. And it was quite cold, but we managed to stay warm. The Germans were infiltrating the base, or they thought they were. Some bases they were. So they had us standing guard around the air base. Can you imagine how many people it took to surround an air base? And we were out there in the fields, this was primarily farming country, with these 45s. I never saw a German. If we'd have seen one, we'd have probably shot each other. But we did stand guard around that field a number of nights.
To make the living situation at the airbase even more trying, however, was periodic German attacks from above, as the desperate Luftwaffe attempted to assemble some sort of last-ditch offensive.
One time during the Battle of the Bulge, they were sounding sirens that the German fighters were in the area. And we ran out. There were bomb craters near our tent that we had made when we bombed this German field that we now had. And we used those bomb craters as our foxhole. So when the sirens went off, we ran out a lot of times, several times that night, and jumped in the bomb crater. And after doing that a few times, I think I made the remark that I didn't give a darn if they dropped the bomb in that stove, pot-bellied stove. I wasn't running out in the cold again. And I got down to my long underwear, and about the time I was gonna crawl in my bunk, here came several German planes strafing. Well, that is one scary, scary situation for planes to be strafing. So I tore out of the tent as I was going around, heading for the bomb crater. I tripped on one of the guide wires of the tent, but I crawled. I felt too exposed to stand up, and I crawled and jumped in that bomb crater in my underwear. And it was, I don't know, it was probably 10 or 15 degrees or something, but strafing planes would make you change your mind about things.
The missions continued for the 387th, and eventually the winter turned to spring. This brought better weather, but the missions were no less challenging. With the Allied forces now closing in on Berlin, the targets continued to get only more deadly, as the flak was heaviest closest to the German capital.
Another narrow call I had during the war we did have an engine shot out. We were on the target. I forget where we were going that day. The engine was heating up and smoking, and we stayed in formation till the bombs were dropped. And then when we dropped the bombs, we dived off. We shut the engine down and feathered it. And a 26 could not hold altitude on a single engine. So we gradually were losing altitude to keep up airspeed. At the lower altitude, the air gets thicker, and that would hold the plane up. So the high altitude where it's thin, if it didn't have much power, it'd sink fast. But it would vary, but a B-26 would hold its altitude, say, from 2 to 4 or 5,000 feet. We went into some clouds cover, which protected us as we were losing altitude heading back home. And we debated if we came out of the clouds over Germany and they started shooting at us, whether we'd keep going or just go on and bail out. But fortunately, we broke out on our side. We did not have any flak when we came out of the clouds, and we made it home safely on single engine, which with a B-26 was quite an accomplishment. Many times they did not make it home on one engine.
As the tour went on, the seasoned veterans found out that not only the target could potentially determine the risk of a mission, but also the aircrew with which you were assigned. And in particular, there was one aircraft that none of the men wanted to find themselves on.
That's Heavenly Body. Heavenly Body was the colonel's plane. Our colonel, commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Keller. And I'll tell you a little story about him. He didn't fly many missions, but occasionally he would fly one and select him a co-pilot. But nobody wanted to fly with Colonel Keller because after bombs were away, he would dive down over the target to see if we'd hit it or not and endanger the plane. So he was 29 years old, as I remember. We figured he was old enough to die, but we were too young. So we didn't want to fly with Colonel Keller.
As the war-weary men battled on and the Germans were pushed towards their final defensive positions, many of the crews, like that of Kendall Eakes and Beryl Lass, that had flown high numbers of missions, were given brief periods of relief. This would give them a moment away from the war before returning to combat.
I remember going on 2 flak leaves. That's just giving you a break from the war. They put us up at these hotels, nice hotels in Paris, and we went to the nightclubs and chased the girls and just enjoyed the entertainment, the shows.
But even with such periods of relaxation, not everyone could cut it as a combat crewman. The stress was simply enough to break some men.
I can tell you one incident that relates the fear of it. After our first few missions, the engineer on our plane refused to fly. He said he could not stand it. He was a staff sergeant, a little Jewish boy, Freddie Cohen, but he said he just could not stand it, and he refused to fly. So he was busted from a staff sergeant down to a private, and he spent the rest of the war washing planes and doing menial jobs like that. So his nerves just wouldn't stand it. Next tent to us was a navigator that was a Jewish man named Lieutenant Molotov. And he really cussed Fred out that he could be a reflection on his race by quitting. He just quit. We had another Jewish boy on our crew, Marty Hurwitz. He was our radio operator. So we had two Jewish boys, so Marty stuck it out. But they really dressed Fred down for quitting. But he said his nerves couldn't stand it. Scared to death.
As replacement crew members came and went, the Allied forces closed in on victory. And on one of these missions, on March 24th of 1945, the 387th received a very unique assignment. This was close pre-landing support for the airborne troops taking part in Operation Plunder Varsity.
Up on the Elbe River, this was towards the end of the war, I think, the Elbe River, our paratroopers were going in to parachute out and fight some battle along the river. As we were going, just before we got to the target, we passed the flight of transport planes that were carrying the parachuters. And just before we got to the target, and then we dropped what they call fragmentation bombs that were supposed to just scatter fragmentation all over the earth to clear up the soldiers. And then as we were turning off the target, here came the paratroopers bailing out of the plane. That was an unusual sight. They were right behind us, less than a minute behind us. So they bailed out where we had just dropped these fragmentation bombs. We hope we got the Germans before they hit the ground.
In the month of April, the final missions would be flown by the 387th and the 9th Air Force. Kendall Eakes fortunately would survive these and would live to see victory in Europe.
I was at Maastricht, Holland when the war was over, and we had this great celebration in Maastricht with the local people that night, walking up and down the streets, hooping and hollering. They dug up old gin bottles, and we were drinking and carrying on. So we had quite a celebration in Maastricht when the war was over.
In January of this year, shortly after the premiere of my first video with him, Kendall Eakes passed away at the age of 101. Getting to tell his story was a privilege, and we hope that it allows his story and the sacrifice of many of those who served with him to live on for many years. Special thanks to the Eakes family and everyone who helped to make this video possible. There are only a handful of living veterans left, and we're still trying to get to them. If you want to help us do that, please consider supporting me on Patreon here so we can keep going. And if you know a living veteran of the air war in World War II, Korea, or Vietnam, fill out the form in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.